So let's talk about the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867. Here's what you need to know. Okay, so why is this compromise so important? Well, it led to the creation of a brand new kind of empire, one that lasted for more than 50 years. So the Austro-Hungarian Compromise, also known as the Ausgleich in German, created a dual monarchy. Now, what does that mean? Well, it meant that Austria and Hungary were now two separate states ruled by the same monarch. And this monarch was the Emperor of Austria and the King of Hungary. And this guy held both titles because he inherited them from his uncle, the previous ruler. His uncle, by the way, was forced to abdicate after losing the throne of both Austria and Hungary during the revolutions of 1848. Anyway, the new monarch was Franz Joseph I, and he inherited a real mess. Let me catch you up on what happened prior to 1867, so by the mid-1800s. The Austrian Empire was in big trouble. Remember, the Austrian Empire was made up of lots of different nationalities and ethnic groups, and they were all starting to get restless. There were the Germans, the Hungarians, the Czechs, the Slovaks, the Croats, Romanians, Serbs, and many others. And these people wanted more rights and more control over their own affairs. Meanwhile, Austria had suffered some serious defeats. First, there was the loss of the Italian states in 1859, and then they got embarrassed in the Austro-Prussian War against Prussia in 1866. In fact, that war was such a disaster that the victorious Prussians occupied Austrian territory and refused to leave until the Austrians agreed to form a new alliance with them. Now, that humiliation pushed the Austrians to finally make peace with the Hungarians. The Hungarians had been rebelling since 1848, and even though they lost, everyone thought they had a good cause. Now, the Austrians needed to make a decision. They could try to keep the empire together by force, but that seemed like it would lead to constant unrest and maybe even more wars. Or they could try to work with the Hungarians and grant them more autonomy and see if that satisfied everyone else. They decided to go with option 2 in 1867. Franz Joseph signed the Austro-Hungarian Compromise with the Hungarian leader, a guy named Ferenc, and it was brilliant. In many ways, it was a perfect compromise. The Hungarians got everything they wanted, and so did the Austrians. It seemed like it solved the nationalities problem. The compromise established two states, Cisleithania and Transleithania. Now, Cisleithania was made up of Austria and the other German-speaking territories, and Transleithania was made up of Hungary and its neighbors. Now, these two states shared the same monarch, Franz Joseph, but they had separate governments, separate parliaments, and each state had equal power. In addition, the compromise addressed some of the other issues within the empire. For example, it granted more rights to the Czechs and the Slovaks. But those concessions didn't really matter because the biggest threat to the empire, the Hungarians, were appeased. The compromise also led to an economic boom. The empire was now more stable, so trade and industry flourished. Vienna and Budapest became centers of commerce and culture. The empire even became a destination for immigrants from all over Europe. However, the compromise did have its limits. It didn't really solve the national question. Sure, the Hungarians were happy and the Austrians were happy, but everyone else was still marginalized. For example, the Italians, the Romanians, the Serbs, and the Croats all wanted the same thing, more autonomy. But the Austrians didn't want to give it to them. So that simmered just below the surface. Then in 1914, everything blew up when Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. The assassination triggered World War I, and after 4 years of fighting, the empire was no more. Remember, the dual monarchy was already weak because of all the ethnic tensions. Those tensions became even worse during the war. By 1918, the Austro-Hungarian army had collapsed. There were full-scale rebellions in Serbia, Romania, and elsewhere. On October, revolutionaries in Hungary even proclaimed the end of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. So, that's why we remember the Austro-Hungarian Compromise today. It tried to solve the problems of a multi-ethnic empire. It managed to last for more than 50 years, but ultimately it failed. The forces of nationalism were too strong and the compromise couldn't hold back the tide.